social media are single, no kids, unmarried, and there's a lot of personal failings there that are not transparent to people, right? A person cannot see sort of instabilities on Facebook when someone's sort of emotionally or psychologically unstable and they're lashing out at people on social media. That's not something that necessarily is obvious, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen people debate on social media for hours on end, and that's not a normal thing to do. And yet it's a very normal thing to witness, right? There's something strange about a person spending hours at a time in front of their keyboard, arguing with somebody in a nested comment about something as if it is a life or death situation, right? And instead of them actually having a life that they have to move on to,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's very telling as to what's going on here. And I think that's a broader, very broad problem, and that in fact the social media realities exacerbate the type of problems that we have.
Yeah.
Because what social media does is it creates a sort of alienation and an isolated living where people begin to feel very lonely, very depressed, very anxious, right? It exacerbates those feelings.
Yeah.
So what happens is people become frenetic, right? They lash out, become argumentative. And that's just a function of just this broad-based displacement that people are finding themselves in. And we have to provide for people, I think, principally this idea of how do we give, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, right? Allah says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا استجيبوا لله وللرسول, right? Oh, you who believe, respond to Allah and His Messenger. إذا دعاكم لما يحييكم, when they call you to that which gives you life. And I think that what's occurred in the West is a tremendous opportunity for Muslims if they could only recognize it, like this imperative to do da'wah and to provide people an alternative discourse and a way of understanding themselves and the world and their placement in it and God and submission and faith and prophetology and the Prophet ﷺ and everything that gives to a person in this life and the next, right? If we can communicate the profundity of that and show that how that gives us a true expression of how to be just people in society, of how to be moral citizens, of how to think of ourselves, of how to disagree and enter into disagreements in a way that is comported towards truth and not victory, but truth becomes the locus of what we're going for. I think people participate differently.
I think
And
so, yeah.
when a person is geared towards truth, it may mean that they become very angry, right? Right? Anger becomes justifiable in certain contexts, right? Because as a Muslim, we love and we hate for Allah's sake. Right? Both of those things are justified. The Prophet ﷺ, right? Allah described him as a giver of glad tidings and a warner, bashira wa nadira, right? So it's not as if we just become dispassionate, indecisive citizens who don't have opinions about things, but it's that our passions emanate from a place of deep moral commitment and connection to God. And that's something that's sustainable. What the social justice current is, to me, is it's very much a fad. And it is going, for many Muslims, it is going to produce a type of burnout effect and a jadedness and a cynicism. Because what happens when people do not find at the end of the tunnel the type of promises that the social justice movement has given to them?
They become the baby boomers.
Of course, they just become consumers who are lost in society and have no location, and they are resentful and they become contemptible towards people. They have a lot of contempt towards others. And that type of attitude is one that I think is a natural outgrowth. I think the social justice movement a lot of times midwives those the sort of idealistic young person, and it births a sort of cynical detachment from the world because it rides so high on promises of trying to change the world into this sort of utopian betterment. And it is only when people begin to realize that there has to be more to the world than this, and that this isn't giving me the type of personal fulfillment that I thought it was going to give me. And in fact, it's resulting in me being derelict to the type of moral duties and obligations that I should be looking after, whether it's my family, my wife, my children, my husband. All of these things are things that are more deeply located in faith-based realities. You know, the family, the masjid, right? And it's not, and that's why we have to try to present a complementary vision that is not sort of oblivious to being justice oriented, but that sees justice in a larger framework, right? That's anchored in the Quran and Sunnah, right? Because when a person looks at things that way, they recognize that dhulm and injustice is not simply a function of humans transgressing on other humans, but it's also a function of a person not fulfilling their rights in front of Allah. And that's why Allah referred to shirk as dhulm. Inna shirka la dhulmun azim. Right? Luqman said to his son, وَإِذْ قَالَ لُقْمَانُ لِابْنِهِ وَهُوَ يَعِظُهُ يَا بُنَيَّ لَا تُشْرِكْ بِاللَّهِ. Right? That indeed shirk, indeed associationism, right? Not giving Allah His rights, right? All of those things, sort of disbelief in God, that is the most manifest and greatest form of injustice that can ever be aggressed and asserted in this world, right? And so that's a broader paradigm through which we're looking at injustice, that we're not only geared towards human wrongs, which is very important, but we're also geared towards the type of wrongs that causes people to miss out vis-a-vis their relationship with God.
Yeah. Closing thoughts. Is there a split that will happen in the Muslim community as a result of these type of exchanges?
Yeah, I think the Muslim community has a lot of decisions that it has to make. And I think one of those decisions is are they sort of a community that's defined on the basis of a political shared identity that has no underlying meanings beyond what people give to it? Or are we a community of people that are defined on the basis of the Quran and Sunnah? Right? Is Islam a representative rubric, or are we just going to make that into a sort of cosmetic identity group? I think that's one thing. I think ultimately, at some point, there is probably going to be a rupture. If you look at every other religious community, there's been ruptures that have swung along liberal and conservative lines. And, I think that's probably bound to happen. And, the question is, how do we try to anticipate the types of challenges that people have such that we can prevent them from moving into those things? And if there's a hope that perhaps we come out of this with, it is that more and more people are attuned to the idea that we have to be engaged with young Muslims in trying to commit them to an expression of faith that's serious and religion that's serious, because so long as we don't do that, the only times in which we're ever going to be in conversation with them is when we get personally attacked, right? And that's liable to happen for anybody. And the idea is that type of engagement for a lot of people seems very sort of opportunistic, right? It seems like the only reason now you're talking because you got attacked personally, yeah. Right? That's sort of the way that people, but you haven't made the same overtures or efforts to really engage with us for any number of years while wrongs have been taking place elsewhere, nor have you been engaged with the Muslim community on any number of issues in which your voice may have been useful, usable, and important, right? In trying to help Muslims understand public life, right? Trying to get them to understand public life.